Hey everybody, a quick video for you today. So, in one of my previous videos where I sort of dealt with AR-15 lore, misunderstandings and misconceptions that are popular about the AR-15, sort of spurred on by Wendigoon's video about the early history of the AR-15, I had mentioned some things about the forward assist that tickled a couple of people's tisms. It upset them, I should say. So, the forward assist on the AR-15 is certainly an item of great controversy. Famously, the inventor of the AR-15, Eugene Stoner, was not a fan of it. He thought it was a stupid, useless addition. He was not enthused at the Army's insistence of having it added. And in my video talking about AR-15 lore, I had mentioned that I wasn't going to go into a long-winded defense of the forward assist as a design feature on the rifle because it wasn't really the right place for it. But I did touch on like a couple of items. What I want to do here is not necessarily a long-winded defense of the forward assist, but at least a little bit of context about why the forward assist was there in the first place, what the forward assist is actually there for, and where some of the misconceptions around the forward assist actually come from. Now, we'll back this all the way up to the beginning. So, Eugene Stoner, right, working at Armalite, had designed the AR-15, and he had designed the AR-15 without a forward assist, right? This is back when it had the charging handle up top underneath the quote-unquote carry handle, which was really just the charging handle protector at this point in time, not really even a carry handle. And rifle didn't have a forward assist then. It really didn't have a way to force the bolt forward manually at all. And for sporting arms, for AR-15s that you're using on a flat range in good conditions, whenever there's not any sort of mud or rain or debris or cold or ice or any sort of foreign object interference whatsoever, frankly, you really don't need a forward assist. In the vast, you can do 5,000, 10,000 rounds through a gun, sometimes even without cleaning, and never actually need the forward assist. Where this changes is whenever guns start to get dirty. When guns get dirty or wore out is another serious factor. Or you're running into any number of criteria that aren't closely controlled in ideal situations like you find on a shooting range. This picture starts to get a little bit blurry. At the time that the Air Force, right, 1961, 62, 63, that the Air Force is already okay with the AR-15 because the Air Force's use of rifles at this time is pretty much just like shooting range, good conditions. Maybe the guns will get rained on by guards who are outside in the rain, but they're not going to see heavy field use the way that the Army or the way that the Marines have used rifles historically. This is backdropped against a bunch of countries that just adopted the FAL, right? The FAL lacked a way to force the bolt manually forward. Universally, the FAL was liked by the countries that adopted it. Almost universally, you can find a document from the militaries that adopted it saying, we wish there was a way to force the bolt home because when the gun's dirty, when it's wet, when it's cold, when it's frozen, when it's icy, it's difficult to get the bolt all the way forward or to ensure that it's forward after you've loaded a new magazine if the gun's dirty. So this is a known complaint, right? A known issue with the FAL at this point in time. And the Army is insistent. We want a way to force the bolt forward on the AR-15 if we are to adopt it, because we've always had a way to do that. And now this is sort of where the conspiracy theories start to run wild, right? Because the Army uses some somewhat bizarre justifications, like they want to be able to close the bolt silently. There's some merit to this. I don't know that it's a ton of merit to this. I think this is more of a psychological, oh, you can close your bolt quietly sort of a thing. It's not really that quiet when you close it, and whenever you sort of go down this rabbit hole, it ends up sounding a lot like, well, the Garand makes a ping whenever the clip ejects and the Germans know when to pop their heads up. I don't think that most of the time in combat, right, it seems very unlikely that you being able to close the bolt quietly, because like you don't have a round loaded already, and it's all quiet, nobody knows you're there, and the first thing you have to do is load the gun. Why wasn't it loaded already is just somewhat confusing. So that was a weird justification for the Army to give, as well as the Army, when asked to justify this to the Department of Defense, they took a live round and a pair of pliers, bent the bullet in the case slightly, and tried to chamber it, and showed, well, it won't chamber. You need a way to, force the bolt forward. And Eugene Stoner points to that as being like, look, they had to invent a situation where it would make sense to have this. It's important to understand that contextually, the Army understands why you would need a forward assist, but they have to justify that to their bosses, and their bosses are literally a bunch of like Harvard graduate idiots, right, that wear white shoes, right? They're a bunch of East Coast elitists, really, is what they are, and they know nothing about guns. They know literally nothing about guns, right? As much as you imagine those coastal liberals knowing nothing about guns today, that's how it was then, too. And so, McNamara and his Department of Defense didn't know anything about guns, and so you have to give them a visual example. You can't just say, well, eventually a gun will get dirty, eventually a gun will get wet, eventually a gun will get corroded, or it has parts that are worn out, or it's going to get frozen because it's cold, right? There's a large number of situations that could lead you to needing to force the bolt forward, but you can't explain that to them, you have to show that to them. And the easiest way to show it's bending a bullet and putting it in the gun and being like, look, see, this is why. And that actually convinced the Department of Defense that it was necessary enough that they let the Army go ahead and insist on it. And the Army got what they wanted, and forward assist was added. There were several different designs for forward assist. If you go and read the Black Rifle, it's got pictures of some of the different designs. One of them was underneath the charging handle. You sort of like pushed in and forward on a little slot. That was the design that Eugene Stoner favored because, you know, in his cynical words, it would be easier to take off later whenever everybody agreed that it's totally unnecessary, which is foreshadowing because that didn't ever happen. No rifle is more scrutinized than the AR-15 in U.S. military service. It's been scrutinized every step along the way, and they've tried to replace it about 500 times now, and they haven't, at least not yet. I don't think the Sig Spear is really going to be the one to do it, but that remains to be seen. But it's stuck around longer than anything else has, right? It has been scrutinized more than any other rifle has. If this was causing jams or problems or malfunctions, or it was a training issue for troops that was causing all sorts of trouble, it would have gone away in the 60s, right? Because in the 60s, they were producing slick side and forward assist guns side by side, and they were serving side by side in Vietnam. It would have gone away if it was actually a problem. Anyway, this sort of sets the stage, right? So the AR-15 now has a forward assist. Eugene Stoner goes on to talk about how awful it is, how stupid it is, and frankly, the justification the Army gave for it was a little silly, but it's important to understand in context. They gave that justification because they have to justify it to the Department of Defense, which is made up of a bunch of not gun people. So we have our prop, M16A4 semi-auto lower, of course, to look at today. We will get rid of our bullet holder there. I want to rig up a couple of tests with this gun that will sort of demonstrate what the forward assist is for, and then we can talk about some of the things that it's not for. Because right, the common criticism about the forward assist is that it's a jam enhancer, and this is something that Stoner talked about, that, well, if the round doesn't want to go into the gun, you shouldn't force it in there. There's a kernel of truth to this, where if the round really, really isn't going in the gun, you shouldn't force it, you should get it out. But there are times that, because of the AR-15 works, and we'll get into this, because of the way the AR-15 works, it's actually entirely possible to have your gun jam in such a way that pulling the bolt back is not going to get the round out of the chamber. It's going to stay in the chamber. And then you're going to slingshot the bolt and cause a double feed, so you have to pull the bolt back, drop the magazine, let the bolt go forward. You may still have a round in the chamber, and pulling the bolt back may not get it out. And this is the sort of thing that the forward assist is meant to alleviate, right? Because you can get yourself into a situation where you will spend like 2 minutes trying to remedy this malfunction in the AR-15 that can be solved like this. It's done, right? It's fixed, it's solved. And then you can get the round out of the chamber. And this is why the forward assist exists. This is what it's for. There's also probably psychological reasons for it. I'll touch on those very briefly. The psychological justifications I've seen that make the most sense is that if you're in the dark, fresh magazine in the gun, close the bolt. Did the bolt close? I mean, how can you tell, right? If you take your pinky in the dark and you feel around up there, right at the front of the bolt carrier, it feels like it's closed, but if it's actually right there and it's not actually closed, it doesn't really feel that different than when it is actually closed. You can't tell. And if you're in the dark in a combat situation, right, you can't just turn on your flashlight and be like, oh, yep, it's definitely on, it's definitely closed, definitely good, because then you're going to get shot. So there's a psychological benefit to being able to go, fresh mag in, close the bolt, and go, yep, it's closed. People like to laugh at this like it's silly, but it's similar to press checks, and I talked about this in the previous video where, like, whenever you press check a gun, right, you rack the bolt, get a live round in the gun, and then you pull the bolt back slightly just to see that there is for sure a round in the chamber. You are able to feel when the round goes in there. You shouldn't have to do that, right? But doing it is a psychological thing. It's one of these, like, yes, I'm positive there's a round in the chamber because I checked. Yes, I'm positive that the gun is closed because I checked. So, digging into the way that the AR-15 actually works is very important to understanding the forward assist. When we look at an AR-15's bolt carrier, we see, of course, our bolt up here. Whenever this goes to feed from a magazine, the bolt is going to come across the top of the magazine and push a round out of it, right? And this round will go up the barrel extension and into the chamber. However, the extractor does not grab this round until the round is all the way in the chamber and until the bolt starts to rotate shut. At that point, the extractor is actually forced up and over the rim on the cartridge. I call this humping because the extractor sort of has to hump up and over the rim on the cartridge. This humping action requires a little bit of kinetic energy from the bolt carrier, right? The bolt carrier has to be coming forward with a little bit of momentum to actually get the extractor to hump over, because just the static spring pressure from your buffer spring usually isn't enough, especially not if your gun is dirty. And we'll rig up a couple of tests to sort of demonstrate that to you. So if we pop our upper and lower completely apart here, I trim my fingernails, and I'm going to have trouble with this. There we go. We pop our upper and lower apart. You can set the lower to the side because we don't actually need it for this demonstration here. So we obviously won't use a live round because that's not safe or whatever. But we will use blanks because, you know, here we can light off blanks indoors and it's okay. So we have a blank here. What we're going to do is manually put that in the chamber. Now what this is doing is emulating the bolt feeding the round out of the magazine, right? But now we're not going to have any spring pressure. So we're just trying to see, you know, how hard is it for the bolt carrier group to actually hump over the round. Because one of the things that, you know, forward assist haters will say is you can just push on this little divot and get the bolt carrier to go forward. It's pretty darn hard, right? It takes a pretty considerable amount of thumb pressure. Now imagine the bolt carrier's hot. I'm not pushing on a hot bolt carrier that hard. Not going to happen. I'm not doing it because it would burn. It would suck pretty bad, actually. Imagine you have a bolt carrier. This bolt carrier's really clapped out. If we do the gas ring check, right, it's going to fall. It's you know, it's worn in, right? It's worn in just a little bit. With a brand new bolt carrier that's not worn in, this test is even harder. But for our purposes here, we can see it's, you know, it's a fairly worn in upper, worn in bolt carrier group. And even still, pushing there, it's really hard. And you have to really get your body weight behind it in order to be able to do it. And I mean, it's not comfortable, right? It kind of it hoits my little thumb. And you can do this on your guns just as a check. Now, let's say that, you know, because again, the reason we're doing this without the buffer spring is we're saying there's so much drag in the upper because we're simulating it being dirty and wet and frozen and icy and grimy. And it's so dirty and icy and grimy that the buffer spring's pressure forward is canceled out by the friction in the upper whenever the bolt gets this close to closing. You can get an AR this dirty pretty easily. Take some sand and dump some sand in there. The buffer spring will stop pushing it when it gets there. Right? You can get an AR dirty enough pretty easily to the point that, like, right around here, the buffer spring stops doing anything. So you have to slingshot it, and then it goes that far forward, and then it goes that far forward. And you keep slingshotting it, and slingshotting it, and slingshotting it. But by the time it gets here, look what you can do. That's way easier than having to do this. This only gets exaggerated whenever you consider these guns were expected to serve in Alaskan and Arctic climates, right? Very, very cold climates. If you've seen the size of the mittens that they wear, you would certainly understand that with those mittens, you really can't get a thumb on this cutout. This cutout's there so that it can pop the dust cover door open, right? That's why that cutout's there. It's not really for you to push on. While you can push on it, it's not quite effective, right? It's not quite the right solution, if you will. So that's why the forward assist is here, really, is, you know, this is way easier, especially with gloves, especially if you're wet, if you're cold, if you're shaky, if there's adrenaline. You know, you've lost your sort of fine motor skills and it's down to gross motor skills. That's a lot easier than if you're all shaky, you're finding your way in here, and then having to push forward, especially if your gun's wet or slimy or oily. It's difficult to do that. The forward assist then, you know, solves this issue. And I want to stress that this is a very real issue. You can get an AR-15 dirty enough relatively easily that, you know, by the end of its stroke forward on the recoil spring, it goes that far. And it stops there because the extractor just doesn't have enough juice to hump over the round, you know, the rim of the round. And that's, you know, that's sort of the big use case for the forward assist then. In early AR-15 testing, most of the, you know, a lot of the jams anyway that the gun was having could be remedied by pushing on the forward assist. This almost certainly was responsible for cementing the forward assist's place on the rifle, was the fact that, like, hey, look, here's a very common jam that happens. Push the button and it's fixed. We've eliminated like half the jams on the rifle by adding that. That's pretty darn convenient, right? That's pretty darn smart then, right? It's not a bad solution. It's certainly not like a jam enhancer. And while you can enhance jams on this gun, I want to stress that in order for that to happen, there needs to be a cascading failures of training to let that happen. You need to have a round that's like, you know, it either the case wasn't shaped correctly, which with factory new ammunition's incredibly unlikely, like, you know, on the orders of, like, you're going to be struck by lightning 5 times in a day by the time you're going to have a round like that. Extremely unlikely to that extent. It is possible, though, to have rounds where the bullet isn't seated deep enough into the case, in which case you would have resistance on chambering that the forward assist would fix. But it's not going to be a thing where like you've jammed the bullet so far in there that it's never going to come out. It's not going to explode the gun. It's not going to have any sort of dramatic issues. It may increase the chance that you have like the rim get tore off the round when it goes to extract, but it's not terribly likely. I had a whole batch of hand loads, even 223 hand loads that I had made that would seat reliably in one gun, but not in AR-15s. At least the AR-15 I had at the time that I was testing with. And so you had to either bump the forward assist or really slingshot the bolt to get it completely seated. And it's just because the ogive on the bullets that I was using was slightly long, they weren't seated quite deep enough, and so they chambered really, really tight, right? The bullet was going to pre-engage the rifling just a little bit. But that little bit of convincing got it home. None of these rounds had their rims case off, none of them had case head separation, none of them had dramatic failures, right? It didn't cause jams. In fact, it solved them. The chances that you have a whole lot of ammunition that's like that from a manufacturer, even back in the 1960s, was basically non-existent, right? They had solved those issues much earlier on. But that just sort of goes to show that you have to have ammunition that's wrong. It's long enough it's long enough in overall length. It's not going to fit in magazines, so you have to be hand loading these rounds one at a time in there. So you're certainly aware of the fact that something's jacked up, and then you have to be pushing the button. Oh, and then it still works fine. By the way, it doesn't like blow the gun up or cause any dramatic failures. So that sort of wraps up most of the things to talk about with the forward assist. It's one of those things that I think is best summarized from a standpoint of if your use of an AR-15 is entirely relegated to flat ranges, good weather, not going to be raining, not going to be snowing, not going to be dealing with mud or sandstorms or any of this nonsense that people in combat have historically had to deal with, the forward assist is probably actually literally a useless vestigial thing that you can just take straight off your gun and it won't be a problem. Even in a lot of shooting matches, right? Because a lot of shooting matches, like if your gun jams, you have a little bit of trouble. It's like, well, crud, I bombed this stage and I parred out. In combat, it could be you dying. And having a button that makes it maybe less likely to die, even if that's just psychological, right? Even if the effect is, I mean, we've demonstrated now, right? The effect is not just 100% psychological. It solves a jam. That does happen with these rifles. But even if it didn't, just the psychological benefit, I think is worth the added expense, the added complexity, just to have it there on the gun. Because it's nice to be able to go, it's closed, and it's, I mean, if your life really came down to it, it's nice to be able to go, you've always got in the back of your mind, if my gun jams and I need it right then, I can try something. I've got something I can do, rather than just hopelessly slingshot at and cause a double, triple, quadruple feed, and then you end up going to talk to the pearly gates and all that, having your job interview for the rest of your life. So, the forward assist, that's sort of my feeling on it, that for most people, it is unnecessary. On a military gun, I think it doesn't just make sense. I think it's a good idea. And this is sort of contrary to a lot of like the whole, there's like a Reddit hive mind around the fact that like, oh, you have to hate the forward assist because Eugene Stoner said it was bad. Well, Eugene Stoner said the Edgewater buffer was good and that chrome lining wasn't necessary. He was wrong. He was wrong multiple times about the AR-15, and that's okay. He was still a genius. He was still brilliant, still a great gun designer. He was not always right, though. The Edgewater buffer, by and large, was what was responsible for the AR-15 being as unreliable as it was in Vietnam. Right? Most of the people that had their guns jammed next to them, Edgewater buffers at the end of the day, had the buffer design been the improved buffer from the beginning, these people wouldn't have had these situations happening to them at whatever rate they actually happened. So, again, Stoner, he's not infallible. I think he was wrong about the forward assist on the military rifle. His experience in the military, he did serve. His experience in the military wasn't in combat. It certainly wasn't in combat in adverse environments, and I think if it had been, he would have had a forward assist on the gun from day one, and not like this little cope pushing on this little recess that's really only there so the dust-covered door can close. It would have been an actual forward assist of some sort. Or maybe he would have made a side-charging AR. Who knows? It's hard to say. Maybe. That could have been our alt-history ARs. It's a side-charging from the get-go so that you have a way to get the bolt closed. Anyway, I hope this video has been at least somewhat useful, informative to some of you guys as far as why is the forward assist there? Because I've seen some people just straight up not understand why it's there. And hopefully this has keyed you into a little bit of why it is there. I guess I've got a Patreon if you guys want to check that out. I'm not sure how often I'll be making videos like this necessarily. I sort of just make videos randomly, and it's kind of fun. And that all said, I hope you guys have a good time, and you can go, there's a cope section down there, and you can tell me all about how stupid I am and how you've shot 1,000,000, billion, gorillion, trillion rounds, and they were all underwater in the water sand mud, and that your gun never jammed and you never have to use a forward assist. I believe you. You're so right, and I'm owned. You're so right. It's so true. You can go ahead and put whatever you want in the cope section, but I think the forward assist isn't a bad idea for a military rifle, and I think the Army had legitimate reasons for having it at the time. I think they have legitimate reasons for keeping it around, and I think there's legitimate reasons that it's still around today. And in fact, you'll see other manufacturers that make other firearms incorporate forward assists on bolts that didn't have a reciprocating element attached to them because of the fact that it's a good idea. But, what do I know, right? I'm just making stuff up over here. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.